The spark of change. Mrs. Emily Richards was known throughout Westbrook Elementary School as a stern but efficient sixth-grade teacher. She had spent nearly 25 years refining her teaching methods, ensuring her students adhered to strict rules, and kept up with her high standards. With her impeccable attire and neat bun, Mrs. Richards carried herself with an air of authority. Her classroom was always orderly, the walls lined with her meticulously crafted charts, displaying math formulas, grammar rules, and a few motivational quotes that had once inspired her to teach. But Mrs. Richards had grown weary over the years. Her passion for nurturing young minds had been overshadowed by the bureaucratic red tape of the education system, and a hint of bitterness lingered under her disciplined exterior. She used to believe that every child was a blank slate brimming with potential, but now she saw them as varying levels of manageable. Her frustration often targeted students who required more attention, feeling they disrupted the flow of her well-oiled classroom machine. One of those students was Jordan, a soft-spoken, resilient boy in a wheelchair. Jordan's physical disability required accommodations, and at times, more patience than Mrs. Richards felt she could afford. His movements were slow, and his wheelchair took up extra space in her neatly aligned rows of desks. Jordan's intelligence was evident, but his disability seemed like a constant obstacle in her mind. Today, Mrs. Richards began her math lesson on fractions with her usual no-nonsense tone, her gaze darting across the room to ensure every student was attentive. Jordan, at the back, struggled to adjust his wheelchair closer to his desk. Mrs. Richards sighed audibly, her patience already worn thin. "Jordan, please try to keep up," she said, her voice tinged with exasperation. Jordan flushed and mumbled an apology, but Mrs. Richards had already moved on. Convinced that he was slowing down her lesson, the students, sensing her impatience, focused on their work, but attention hung in the air, a silent awareness of the widening gap between Jordan and his classmates. Inwardly, Jordan felt his confidence chip away. He enjoyed math but felt isolated by the subtle hints Mrs. Richards threw his way. He began to keep his head down, focused on his workbook, hoping to escape her critical gaze. Later, during recess, Jordan joined his friends near the basketball court. They'd come up with a unique system that allowed Jordan to participate. As the designated passer, he would use his strong arms to throw the ball to his teammates, a role that allowed him to shine. His friend Lucas beamed at him. "Come on, Jordan. Let's see that arm." For a moment, Jordan forgot about his classroom struggles, throwing the ball with all his might to Lucas, who caught it with ease. He was just another kid playing with his friends, enjoying the warmth of the sun and the camaraderie of his peers. But the reprieve was short-lived. "Time's up." Mrs. Richards' sharp voice cut through the playground chatter as she motioned for everyone to return to class. Jordan maneuvered his wheelchair over the uneven ground, his friends patiently slowing their pace to stay with him. Mrs. Richards watched from the door, her foot tapping with barely concealed impatience. "Jordan, can you hurry up? The rest of the class is waiting." Her tone was sharp, and her voice carried through the playground. Jordan's cheeks flushed as he tried to push his wheelchair faster, but the rough terrain made it difficult. His friends lingered behind him, casting sympathetic glances his way, but Mrs. Richards waved them inside. "No need to wait, kids. Get to your seats," she commanded, her tone brisk. As Jordan finally reached the door, panting slightly, Mrs. Richards held it open, a tight smile on her face. "Jordan, you need to find a way to keep up with the rest of the class," she said firmly, leaning down to his eye level. "Your classmates can't wait for you every time." The words stung. Jordan rolled himself into the room, his heart heavy, and his earlier joy fading into a bitter memory. The rest of the class went on, with Jordan barely lifting his head, struggling to focus. Mrs. Richards noticed, but dismissed his demeanor as simple inattentiveness. She felt no remorse. In her mind, she had only been reinforcing the expectations all her students should meet. Yet, the following day brought an unexpected observer. As the class filed into the gym for physical education, Mrs. Richards stood with a clipboard in hand, explaining the day's obstacle course. "All right, everyone. We'll start with jumping over the low hurdles, crawling under the net, and finally, sprinting to the end. I expect everyone to do their best." The students were excited, cheering as they prepared to tackle the challenge. Jordan, however, felt a knot form in his stomach. He loved being active, but knew he couldn't do most of these tasks in his wheelchair. He looked at Mrs. Richards, hoping for some accommodation or guidance. Mrs. Richards gave him a cursory glance. "Jordan, just do what you can manage," she said, gesturing dismissively. Determined to try, Jordan wheeled himself to the starting point and maneuvered around the first set of cones with all his strength. His friends cheered him on, but Mrs. Richards' impatience was palpable as she watched him struggle. "Come on, Jordan," she barked, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're holding up the class." Jordan's face flushed with embarrassment. He tried to push himself faster, but his arms were already trembling from exertion. The other students exchanged uneasy glances, disturbed by their teacher's words. Some shifted uncomfortably, sensing the unfairness in her treatment of Jordan. And unbeknownst to Mrs. Richards, a quiet figure stood observing from the sidelines. A woman with kind eyes and a composed demeanor, Mrs. Samuels, a parent volunteer, had been organizing books in the library when she overheard Mrs. Richards' harsh words. Her heart ached as she watched Jordan struggle, tears brimming in her eyes as she saw the young boy's face flush with humiliation. Mrs. Samuels could barely contain her emotions. She watched as Jordan fought to maintain his composure, a resilience that seemed beyond his years. Her heart pounded as she quietly slipped out of the gym, a determined resolve forming within her. She made her way down the hall, her steps echoing off the walls as she approached the principal's office. Her expression was serious, her hands trembling as she knocked on the door. "Come in," Principal Hugh's calm voice called out. Mrs. Samuels took a deep breath, pushing open the door to find Principal Hughes seated at his desk, a curious expression on his face. "Principal Hughes," she began, her voice tight with emotion, "I need to speak with you about Mrs. Richards. I witnessed something today, something I cannot let pass." Principal Hughes motioned for her to sit down, his face growing more serious as Mrs. Samuels recounted what she had seen. Her words flowed with conviction, describing the pain and humiliation Jordan had endured under Mrs. Richards' callous treatment. She recounted every detail, the impatience, the lack of understanding, and the clear disregard for Jordan's needs. By the time Mrs. Samuels finished, Principal Hughes' face was solemn. "Thank you, Mrs. Samuels," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'll handle this." As she left the office, Mrs. Samuels felt a heavy weight lift from her shoulders. She knew she had done the right thing, standing up for Jordan when he couldn't stand up for himself. But as she walked back to the library, she couldn't shake the sadness that lingered in her heart. She knew this was only the beginning, the unraveling of Mrs. Richards. Mrs. Richards stood at the front of her classroom the following day, oblivious to the quiet storm that had started to brew around her. As her students filed in, she watched them with her usual stern gaze, setting the tone for the day with a clipped, "Quiet down. We have work to do." But today felt different. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but an odd tension hummed beneath the usual order of her classroom. She sensed a few students exchanging glances, whispering in hushed voices. Jordan sat at the back, avoiding eye contact, his face pale and his posture hunched. Mrs. Richards brushed it off, dismissing his demeanor as typical shyness, a problem she thought he should have outgrown by now. As she moved through her lesson on fractions, her mind briefly wandered back to the gym incident. She saw nothing wrong with her actions. She had only tried to prepare him for a world that wouldn't accommodate his limitations. In her mind, Jordan needed to face reality, to understand that life would not bend to meet his needs. She had convinced herself she was doing the right thing. After finishing her lesson, she set the students to work and returned to her desk, preoccupied with her own thoughts. Just then, a knock at the door broke her concentration. Principal Hughes stood in the doorway, his face unreadable, with Mrs. Samuels behind him, a look of quiet concern in her eyes. "Mrs. Richards," Principal Hughes said, his tone calm but firm, "could I have a moment of your time? There's a matter I need to discuss with you." Mrs. Richards felt a twinge of irritation. She wasn't in the habit of being interrupted during her lessons, especially over something as vague as a matter. But the principal's tone left no room for argument. "Of course," she replied, trying to keep her voice neutral. She shot a quick look at her students, who were glancing back with wide eyes. "Continue with your work quietly," she instructed them, before following Principal Hughes and Mrs. Samuels into the hallway. Principal Hughes led her down the corridor, past the bustling classrooms, and into the quiet of his office. Mrs. Richards glanced at Mrs. Samuels, whose eyes were fixed ahead, her face drawn with what seemed like genuine concern. The principal gestured to the chairs across from his desk, and both women took their seats. Once seated, Mrs. Richards turned to Principal Hughes, expecting him to come straight to the point. Instead, he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Mrs. Richards," he began, his tone soft but with an unmistakable firmness, "we need to discuss your recent conduct with Jordan in your gym class." Mrs. Richards' eyes widened slightly. She glanced over at Mrs. Samuels, who was watching her intently. "Conduct," Mrs. Richards echoed, trying to mask the defensiveness creeping into her voice. "I was simply instructing Jordan like any other student. I believe in equal treatment, Principal Hughes." Mrs. Samuels shifted slightly, her lips pressing together. Principal Hughes exchanged a glance with her before turning his attention back to Mrs. Richards. "Mrs. Richards, we've received a formal complaint," he continued, his voice tightening. "Mrs. Samuels witnessed the incident and reported that you humiliated and singled Jordan out because of his disability. Is that accurate?" Mrs. Richards' heart began to race. She had not expected such a strong reaction. Formal complaint. Humiliation. To her, it was just discipline, a necessary measure to teach Jordan about resilience and persistence. She straightened her back, a hint of frustration flickering in her eyes. "Principal Hughes, I assure you, I was only trying to motivate him. Children like Jordan need to learn that they can't expect special treatment at every turn." Mrs. Samuels' expression tightened. "Mrs. Richards, I don't believe you understand the gravity of what happened." Her voice was calm, but there was a steely edge to it. "I watched Jordan struggle, watched his face fall when you singled him out. He wasn't learning resilience. He was learning that his own teacher saw him as a burden." Mrs. Richards opened her mouth to respond, but Principal Hughes cut her off. "Emily," he said, using her first name in a way that caught her attention, "our role as educators is not just to teach academics, but to foster an environment where every child feels safe and valued. We do not diminish a child's self-worth to make a point." The words stung, piercing through her practiced defenses. She felt a pang of unease as she tried to maintain her composure. "Principal Hughes, with all due respect, I have been teaching for over 2 decades, she said, her voice softening as she struggled to find the right words. "I understand that some children have different needs, but I cannot allow one child's limitations to dictate the entire class's progress." Principal Hughes' face softened, but his tone remained unyielding. "Emily, we have an opportunity to reflect on how we approach students with unique challenges. I think it's important that you spend some time gaining perspective on this matter." Mrs. Samuel's gaze was unwavering, her expression calm yet resolute. "We've arranged a meeting with Jordan's parents," she said gently, "and I think it would be beneficial for you to hear their perspective." The room fell silent as Mrs. Richards processed the words. A meeting with his parents. Her throat tightened at the thought, but she swallowed her pride and nodded. "When would you like to schedule this meeting?" she asked, keeping her voice even. "Tomorrow afternoon," Principal Hughes replied. "In the meantime, I'd like you to consider another option as well. We have a partnership with a nearby center that works with children who have similar challenges as Jordan. I believe volunteering there could provide valuable insight." Mrs. Richards felt her stomach drop. volunteering. She hadn't anticipated this level of intervention. But as she looked at the two people seated across from her, she understood there was no alternative. She would have to comply. "Very well," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do as you suggest." The meeting adjourned, and Mrs. Richards returned to her classroom, her mind swirling with conflicting thoughts. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being unfairly criticized. But as the school day wore on, she noticed small changes in her students' behavior, subtle glances, averted eyes, a new reluctance to answer her questions. It was as if they, too, sensed the tension surrounding her actions with Jordan. That night, as Mrs. Richards sat alone in her quiet home, she found herself unable to shake the unease that had taken root in her heart. She felt something shifting within her, a small crack forming in the armor she had so carefully constructed over the years. It was an unfamiliar feeling, but one she couldn't ignore. The following day came all too quickly. After her last class, Mrs. Richards made her way to Principal Hugh's office, where Jordan's parents, Sarah and James Thompson, waited patiently. Both were dressed neatly, their expressions tense but composed. Mrs. Richards entered, greeting them with a polite nod as she took a seat across from them. Principal Hughes began the meeting. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Richards. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson have some concerns they'd like to address." Sarah Thompson spoke first, her voice calm but resolute. "Mrs. Richards, I know teaching isn't easy, and I can't imagine the challenges you face every day. But as Jordan's mother, I can't stay silent about what happened. My son came home yesterday in tears, convinced that he was a burden to you and his classmates. No child should ever feel that way, especially not from someone they look up to." James Thompson's face was drawn, his voice softer but no less firm. "Jordan has always faced challenges, but he's never let them define him. We've worked so hard to show him that his wheelchair doesn't limit his potential. But yesterday, he felt like he was less than everyone else, and that's a feeling he should never have to experience in his classroom." Mrs. Richards felt her composure slipping. She forced herself to meet their gaze, the weight of their words settling heavy in her chest. I'm truly sorry if I hurt Jordan," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I only wanted to prepare him for a world that won't make exceptions." Sarah's eyes softened, and she leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but firm. "Mrs. Richards, I understand that, but children like Jordan face that harsh reality every day. The world is full of challenges for him. School should be a place where he feels safe, where he knows he's valued." The room fell silent, each person absorbed in their own thoughts. Mrs. Richards could feel the weight of her actions pressing down on her, an uncomfortable but undeniable realization. She had failed Jordan. She had let her frustrations cloud her judgment, and in doing so, she had hurt an innocent child. Principal Hughes cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Mrs. Richards, I hope you'll consider our suggestion to volunteer at the center. It could provide you with a new perspective and perhaps help you connect with students like Jordan in a more compassionate way." Mrs. Richards nodded, the words of Jordan's parents still echoing in her mind. "Yes," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll go." The meeting concluded, and Mrs. Richards left the office, feeling a mix of guilt and apprehension. She knew that the path ahead would not be easy, but for the first time, she felt a flicker of determination, a faint but growing desire to make amends. The following day, she found herself standing outside the center, a modest but brightly painted building nestled within a quiet neighborhood. As she stepped inside, she was greeted by the cheerful hum of activity, children laughing, caregivers chatting, and the gentle sounds of music playing in the background. The air was filled with warmth and joy, a stark contrast to the strict order she had imposed in her own classroom. A friendly receptionist named Clara approached her, smiling warmly. "You must be Mrs. Richards," she said, her voice kind. "Welcome. We're excited to have you here. Let me show you around." As she followed Clara through the center, Mrs. Richards felt a growing sense of unease. The children she saw had a variety of needs and challenges, some similar to Jordan's and others unique. But what struck her most was their resilience, the way they navigated the world with determination, their spirits unbroken by the limitations others might see. Clara led her into a large, brightly colored room where children of various ages were engaged in different activities. Some were painting, others building with blocks, and a few were engrossed in games with their peers. Mrs. Richards felt an odd sensation, a mixture of humility and curiosity. Here, the children were thriving, their needs met not with impatience but with genuine compassion. A young boy in a wheelchair caught her eye, his laughter filling the room as he played a game with his friends. His hands moved skillfully, his face lit with pure joy. Mrs. Richards felt a pang in her chest as she watched him. She thought of Jordan, remembering the look of disappointment and hurt in his eyes. One of the caregivers approached her, smiling. "That's Malik," she said, gesturing to the boy. "He's one of our brightest. He loves anything creative, especially music and art." As the day went on, Mrs. Richards found herself interacting with Malik and the other children, each moment chipping away at the rigid beliefs she had once held so tightly. She saw the depth of their intelligence, the uniqueness of their personalities, and the quiet courage that radiated from them. They weren't burdens or disruptions. They were simply children, full of dreams, resilience, and joy. That evening, as she sat alone in her quiet home, Mrs. Richards felt the weight of her experiences settling into her heart. She knew that her journey was only beginning, and that there would be much to confront, both within herself and in her approach to teaching. But as she closed her eyes, she felt a newfound determination, a promise to herself that she would be the teacher her students truly deserved. And perhaps, just perhaps, she could earn back the trust she had lost. A lesson in compassion. Mrs. Richards returned to the center every afternoon for the next 2 weeks, her perspective slowly but deeply shifting with each day. The children she once would have considered burdensome or disruptive were teaching her lessons she had never learned in her 25 years of teaching. One particular day, she arrived to find Malik waiting by the entrance. His excitement was palpable, his eyes sparkling with eagerness. "Mrs. Richards," Malik called out, waving his small hand with enthusiasm. "You're here. Today we're working on our art projects. Want to help?" Mrs. Richards felt a smile pull at her lips, an unusual sensation for her these days, but one that felt increasingly natural around Malik and the other children at the center. She had always prided herself on her professionalism, rarely letting her students see her softer side. Yet here, among these children, she felt a warmth and connection she hadn't experienced in years. "I'd love to help, Malik," she replied, her voice uncharacteristically gentle. Malik led her into the large, brightly lit art room, which was already buzzing with activity. The walls were adorned with colorful artwork, each piece proudly signed by its young artist. Mrs. Richards noted the diversity of expression, each painting and drawing filled with imagination and life. Clara, the center's art instructor, gave her a warm nod as she handed Malik a set of paints and a fresh canvas. "Malik has been working on a series of landscapes," Clara explained to Mrs. Richards, a proud smile on her face. "He's drawn different scenes from his favorite park, and he wants to paint one of them today." Malik held up a rough sketch of his intended painting, a sprawling green field with a big oak tree in the middle. Mrs. Richards marveled at the detail he had managed to capture, his perspective, and the care he put into each stroke. She couldn't help but feel a pang of regret. She had never realized that children like Malik and Jordan could hold such depth of creativity and potential. As she watched Malik paint, Mrs. Richards decided to give it a try herself. She picked up a brush, and though her strokes were clumsy at first, she found herself absorbed in the colors and patterns that formed on her canvas. Malik noticed her efforts and encouraged her, his innocent praise making her feel like a student learning for the first time. For those few hours, she forgot the pressures of her classroom, the weight of her own expectations, and simply enjoyed the process of creating something new. By the end of the session, Mrs. Richards' hands were smeared with paint, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She looked at Malik's finished piece, a vibrant, whimsical landscape with rich greens, warm browns, and a wide blue sky. His face glowed with pride as he held it up for her to see. "This is wonderful, Malik," she said softly, her voice brimming with genuine admiration. "Thanks, Mrs. Richards." Malik beamed, his smile wide. "I wanted to show that even when things seem hard, there's always something beautiful waiting for us." Mrs. Richards felt her throat tighten, her eyes misting with unshed tears. This little boy, facing challenges she could hardly comprehend, had just shared one of the most profound lessons of her career. She realized that Malik and the other children didn't see themselves as limited or incapable. They saw their lives as unique journeys, filled with their own strengths and joys. After the art session, Clara asked Mrs. Richards to join her for a cup of tea in the staff lounge. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching the children play outside through the large windows. "Malik's story is a special one," Clara said softly, as if sensing Mrs. Richards' thoughts. "He was born with a condition that limits his mobility, and he's faced surgeries and therapy his whole life. But he's always been optimistic, always looked at life as an adventure." Mrs. Richards nodded, her gaze still fixed on Malik as he rolled across the playground, laughing with his friends. "He's remarkable," she replied quietly, her mind drifting back to Jordan. Clara's expression softened. "It's easy to assume we know what's best for them, that we're helping them by making them face harsh realities. But sometimes our job is simply to show them compassion, to let them know they're valued for who they are." The words struck a chord in Mrs. Richards, and she realized how far she had strayed from that understanding. In her quest to enforce discipline and order, she had lost sight of the most crucial part of teaching: compassion. The next day, Principal Hughes called her into his office before school, his face warm but serious. He gestured for her to sit, and Mrs. Richards felt a flutter of nerves. She knew this meeting was long overdue. "Emily," he began, leaning back in his chair, "I wanted to check in on your experience at the center. How are things going?" Mrs. Richards took a deep breath, her mind racing through the moments she had shared with Malik, Clara's quiet wisdom, and the lessons she had learned over the past days. She looked up at Principal Hughes, her voice steady, but filled with emotion. "It's been transformative," she said softly. "I never realized how much I had lost touch with the true essence of teaching. I see now that I was so focused on order and efficiency that I forgot why I started teaching in the first place. Those children, they are teaching me more than I could ever teach them." Principal Hughes nodded, his expression approving. "I'm glad to hear that, Emily, but there's one more step I'd like you to take." He paused, watching her carefully. "Jordan's mother has expressed a desire to meet with you privately. She feels that a one-on-one conversation might help bridge the gap between you." Mrs. Richards felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her chest. She remembered Sarah Thompson's calm but piercing words during their initial meeting, the disappointment in her voice as she described the pain her son had endured. "Of course," Mrs. Richards replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She knew that facing Jordan's mother was not just necessary, but vital to her growth as a teacher and as a person. The meeting was scheduled for the next day, after school. Mrs. Richards spent the entire day reflecting on how she would approach the conversation, feeling both remorseful and uncertain. When the time finally came, she found herself nervously smoothing her skirt and straightening her hair as she waited in the small conference room. She had always prided herself on her confidence, but now she felt vulnerable, her defenses stripped away. The door opened, and Sarah Thompson entered, her face calm but unreadable. She took a seat across from Mrs. Richards, folding her hands neatly on the table. "Thank you for meeting with me," Sarah began, her voice even. Mrs. Richards nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson, for giving me the chance to speak with you again. I want to start by saying how sorry I am for what happened with Jordan. I've spent the last few weeks working at the center, and I've come to understand just how much I hurt him. It was never my intention, but intentions don't matter if the impact is harm." Sarah's expression softened slightly, though her gaze remained steady. "I appreciate that, Mrs. Richards, and I know that teaching is a challenging job, but what I hope you understand is that for children like Jordan, the world is already full of barriers. He's learned resilience because he's had to, but he needs to know his worth isn't dependent on his ability to keep up with everyone else." Mrs. Richards nodded, her heart aching with each word. "I see that now. I've been so focused on discipline and results that I've forgotten what really matters. Jordan deserves respect and compassion, just like any other child. I want to earn back his trust and yours, if you'll allow me that chance." Sarah took a deep breath, her eyes softening further. "I believe people can change, Mrs. Richards, if you're committed to supporting Jordan, to making him feel seen and valued, then I'm willing to give you that chance." The tension that had been building in Mrs. Richards' chest released, replaced by a sense of gratitude and determination. She knew this was her moment to make things right. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson," she replied, her voice filled with sincerity. "I won't let you or Jordan down." The meeting ended with a firm handshake and a shared understanding. Mrs. Richards walked back to her classroom, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in years, she felt a clarity of direction. The next morning, as her students filed in, Mrs. Richards stood at the front of the classroom, her gaze lingering on each face. She felt a profound sense of responsibility, an awareness that each child represented a unique journey, one that required patience and understanding. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her tone gentle yet steady. "Before we start today's lesson, I want to share something important with you all." The students looked up, curious. Mrs. Richards took a deep breath, her gaze resting on Jordan, who watched her with a mixture of apprehension and hope. "I want to apologize to each of you, especially to Jordan," she continued, her voice thick with emotion. "I've let my frustrations get in the way of being the teacher you deserve, but that's going to change. From now on, we're going to work together to make this classroom a place where everyone feels respected and valued." The students exchanged glances, a mixture of surprise and relief passing through the room. Jordan's eyes met hers, and she saw the faintest hint of a smile. She knew that the journey to rebuild his trust would be slow, but she was committed to making it happen. Later that day, she introduced a new activity, a collaborative project where students could work together to solve complex problems in a way that played to each of their strengths. She encouraged them to partner up, to rely on each other's unique talents, and to see the power of teamwork. As she watched Jordan and his friend Lucas work together, a sense of fulfillment washed over her. She realized that teaching wasn't about control or order, but about creating an environment where each child could thrive. Over the weeks that followed, Mrs. Richards continued to nurture this newfound sense of compassion. Her interactions with Jordan grew warmer, and she saw him blossom under her encouragement. His confidence returned, and he began to participate more freely, no longer held back by the fear of judgment. In time, Mrs. Richards became not only his teacher but his advocate, ensuring that the school provided the resources and accommodations he needed. She worked closely with Principal Hughes, developing a plan to make the entire school more accessible and inclusive. And through it all, Mrs. Richards felt herself transform, her heart opened by the lessons of empathy and resilience that Jordan, Malik, and the children at the center had taught her. She knew she had been given a second chance, not only to become a better teacher but a better person, building a new legacy. The weeks turned into months, and the changes in Mrs. Richards were no longer subtle. Her colleagues noticed her transformation, her students felt the shift in her presence, and even the parents began to speak of her newfound warmth and dedication. Where she once approached teaching with rigid expectations, she now worked to foster an environment where each child could feel valued and inspired. Her days at the center had left an indelible mark on her, and with each passing week, she took steps to ensure that her new approach was more than a temporary change. She was determined to rebuild the trust she had lost, both with her students and within herself. However, she knew that in order to truly make a difference, she needed to create a lasting impact beyond her classroom. One Thursday afternoon, as Mrs. Richards stood in front of her classroom reviewing a math problem, Principal Hughes appeared in the doorway, motioning for her to come out for a brief conversation. She instructed her students to continue working on the problem in their groups, noticing with a sense of pride that they were already helping one another and exchanging ideas freely, something she had only dreamed of in her previous years of teaching. When she stepped into the hallway, Principal Hughes smiled warmly. "Emily, I wanted to let you know that the board has approved a proposal for additional support programs for students with disabilities," he began. "The changes you've been advocating for have resonated with everyone, and they've decided to expand our school's resources. They've even given the green light to establish an official inclusive education committee, and I'd like you to be its chair." Mrs. Richards felt a surge of both excitement and surprise. She had never imagined herself leading such an initiative, let alone being the one responsible for creating a foundation for inclusivity at Westbrook Elementary. But as she thought about the children she had met at the center, Malik's resilience, Clara's empathy, Jordan's growing confidence, she felt a strong, renewed sense of purpose. This was an opportunity to make a difference on a larger scale, to ensure that no child at Westbrook would feel sidelined, overlooked, or inferior again. "Thank you, Principal Hughes," she replied, her voice filled with gratitude. "I'd be honored to lead the committee. I know I still have so much to learn, but I'm committed to this. This isn't just a project for me. It's a promise." He nodded, sensing her sincerity. "I know, Emily. You've already come so far. Let's keep building on that." That evening, Mrs. Richards sat at her kitchen table, a cup of tea cooling beside her as she mapped out her vision for the committee. She began drafting ideas, her mind filled with memories of the children at the center and the challenges they had overcome with the right support. She wanted Westbrook Elementary to be a school where every student, regardless of their abilities, felt like they belonged, where they were celebrated for their strengths and given the support they needed to succeed. The following week, Mrs. Richards held the first official meeting of the Inclusive Education Committee. Alongside her were a group of teachers, parents, and volunteers, each of whom had expressed a genuine interest in promoting accessibility and understanding within the school community. Mrs. Richards outlined her plans, proposing a multi-pronged approach to inclusivity: awareness workshops for teachers, sensitivity training for students, peer mentorship programs, and classroom accommodations for students with varying needs. She noticed the enthusiasm building as she spoke, the teachers nodding in agreement, and the parents exchanging hopeful glances. The meeting ended with a sense of shared commitment, and as everyone left, Mrs. Richards felt a deep satisfaction. For the first time, she felt she was working towards something that would outlast her own career, a legacy of empathy and inclusion that would impact students for years to come. One of her primary goals was to bring in outside experts to speak with the teachers about disability awareness and to lead training sessions. She reached out to local organizations and secured guest speakers who specialized in various fields, from occupational therapists to advocates for disability rights. She even invited Mrs. Samuels to share her perspective, knowing that her compassionate approach had been a turning point for her own journey. As the new school year began, the Inclusive Education Committee rolled out its first major initiative, an Empathy in Action Week. The event was designed to raise awareness among students and staff, encouraging them to consider the world from different perspectives. During the week, each classroom participated in activities that fostered empathy, including interactive simulations where students experienced tasks with limitations, such as navigating the playground in a wheelchair or reading from a text in Braille. In Mrs. Richards' classroom, she paired each student with a peer who had a unique challenge to overcome. Jordan was matched with Lucas, his best friend, to help lead a discussion about how each of them faced obstacles and how they worked together to overcome them. Lucas shared how much he admired Jordan's resilience, and Jordan explained how he had learned to approach challenges with patience and determination. "Being in a wheelchair doesn't make me any less of a student," Jordan said, his voice confident as he spoke to his classmates. "I may do things differently, but I can do them just as well. And Lucas has shown me that I don't have to face everything alone. Sometimes we all need a little help." The classroom erupted in applause, and Mrs. Richards felt tears welling up as she watched the pride in Jordan's eyes. In that moment, she realized that her journey had come full circle. She no longer saw Jordan or any of her students as problems to be solved or managed. Instead, she saw them as individuals, each with unique strengths, challenges, and perspectives that enriched her classroom and her life. But the impact of Empathy in Action Week didn't stop there. Inspired by the activities, students across the school began to take proactive steps toward inclusivity. Mrs. Richards noticed her students holding doors for each other, offering to help without hesitation, and even suggesting new ideas for making the school environment more accessible. One afternoon, during a lunch break, Amy, one of Mrs. Richards' students, approached her with an idea. "Mrs. Richards," she began, her eyes bright with enthusiasm, "what if we created a buddy program? We could match older students with younger ones who need extra help, so everyone has a friend and someone they can count on. Jordan could be a buddy too, since he knows what it's like to face challenges and still do awesome things." Mrs. Richards smiled, feeling a sense of pride in Amy's compassion. "That's a fantastic idea, Amy. I'll bring it up at our next committee meeting, and maybe you could help us design the program." Amy beamed with excitement, nodding eagerly. The idea quickly gained traction, and within weeks, the Buddy program was officially launched. Each student was paired with a buddy from another grade, and together they participated in activities that built confidence, empathy, and mutual support. As part of the new initiative, Mrs. Richards brought Malik and a few other students from the center to speak to the older classes. Malik, who had become a sort of unofficial ambassador for inclusivity, shared stories of his experiences and talked about how he used creativity and persistence to overcome challenges. The students listened, captivated by his strength and his infectious optimism. Malik's influence was profound, showing the students that even the biggest challenges could be met with courage and determination. Over the following months, Mrs. Richards saw a transformation not only in her students but in herself. Her teaching methods shifted, focusing more on collaboration and adaptive learning. She introduced flexible seating options, allowed students to choose tasks that suited their individual strengths, and encouraged group projects where each student contributed in a way that felt meaningful to them. Her once tightly controlled classroom had evolved into a lively, interactive environment where students felt comfortable expressing themselves and helping one another. Jordan, who had once been shy and withdrawn, had become a leader among his peers, his voice growing stronger with each passing day. His confidence soared as he embraced his role in the Buddy program, guiding younger students through their tasks and inspiring them with his resilience. The end of the school year approached, and Mrs. Richards found herself reflecting on how far she and her students had come. She realized that she had grown to genuinely love each of them, not just as students, but as individuals who had taught her invaluable lessons in compassion, humility, and perseverance. The final day of school arrived, and Mrs. Richards watched her students file in, knowing that this would be a bittersweet farewell. She had prepared a small ceremony to celebrate their accomplishments, and as she looked around the room, she saw the pride in each of their faces. "Today, we're celebrating not just our academic achievements, but our growth as a class, as a family," she began, her voice wavering with emotion. "Each of you has brought something unique to this classroom. You've taught me that kindness, resilience, and empathy are just as important as any subject. I couldn't be prouder of each and every one of you." As she handed out certificates, she paused in front of Jordan, who looked up at her with gratitude in his eyes. She knelt down, meeting his gaze. "Jordan," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion, "thank you for teaching me how to see the world in a different way. You've shown me what true strength and kindness look like, and I am a better teacher because of you." Jordan's eyes filled with tears, and he wrapped his arms around her in a warm hug, his quiet voice filled with sincerity. "Thank you, Mrs. Richards. I never thought I'd have a teacher who believed in me like this." As the bell rang and the students began to gather their belongings, Mrs. Richards felt an overwhelming sense of peace. She knew that her journey had only just begun, and that her commitment to inclusivity and compassion would carry her through the rest of her career. When the room finally emptied, Mrs. Richards lingered, feeling a profound sense of accomplishment and purpose. She glanced at her desk, where a note from Jordan's parents lay. She opened it, her heart swelling as she read their words of gratitude and admiration for the changes she had made in their son's life. The note concluded with a line that resonated deeply within her. "Thank you for becoming the teacher you were meant to be." In that moment, Mrs. Richards made a vow, to herself, to her students, and to every child who would pass through her classroom, that she would continue to be the teacher they deserved, one who saw each of them for their potential, their dreams, and their inherent worth. She knew the journey would be long, filled with challenges, but she welcomed it with open arms, ready to build a legacy of compassion that would endure far beyond her years in the classroom. Planting seeds of change. As the summer break began, Mrs. Richards dedicated herself to building a foundation for the inclusive programs she and her committee had initiated. She spent countless hours in meetings with parents, staff, and community members, forging connections to support her vision of making Westbrook Elementary a place where every child, regardless of their abilities, could thrive. Her transformation over the last year had not gone unnoticed. The school board, moved by the positive impact her efforts had on the school environment, had recently extended an offer to her, a full-time position as the Director of Student Inclusion and Support. It was a new role, one created specifically to oversee and expand the inclusive programs she had pioneered. She accepted the role with both excitement and trepidation. Leaving her beloved classroom felt bittersweet, but she knew that this position would allow her to influence change on a much larger scale. She could now reach beyond her own students, shaping policies that would create an inclusive and supportive environment for the entire district. The first order of business in her new role was planning a district-wide summit on inclusive education, aimed at bringing together educators, parents, and students from all backgrounds. Her goal was to foster awareness, share resources, and inspire schools across the district to adopt similar programs. She envisioned an event that would not only inform but empower each attendee to become an advocate for inclusivity. Mrs. Richards worked tirelessly to bring her vision to life. She reached out to speakers from various organizations, bringing in disability rights advocates, occupational therapists, mental health professionals, and parents of children with special needs. She even invited some of the students she had met at the center, including Malik, to share their stories and perspectives. She knew that hearing directly from those who faced daily challenges would resonate with the attendees in a way that no lecture could. As the day of the summit approached, Mrs. Richards felt both nervous and hopeful. She had poured every ounce of her passion into planning the event, determined to make it a turning point for the district. The morning of the summit, she arrived early, overseeing final preparations as the school's auditorium transformed into a vibrant space, filled with banners, pamphlets, and displays on inclusive education. The atmosphere buzzed with excitement and anticipation. By mid-morning, the auditorium was filled with teachers, administrators, parents, and students from across the district. Mrs. Richards stood on the stage, facing the crowd with a mixture of pride and humility. She took a deep breath before addressing them. "Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here," she began, her voice carrying a warmth and conviction that silenced the room. "We've come together today because we all believe in the potential of every student, regardless of their abilities. We're here because we know that an inclusive environment benefits not just those with disabilities, but every single child who walks through our doors. We're here to build a future where every student feels valued, supported, and capable of achieving their dreams." The audience listened intently as she recounted her own journey of transformation, sharing the moments that had reshaped her perspective and reignited her passion for teaching. She spoke of Jordan's resilience, Malik's unwavering optimism, and the lessons of empathy she had learned from both her students and colleagues. Her words resonated deeply, and she saw nods of agreement and even a few tears among the listeners. After her opening speech, she invited Malik onto the stage. He rolled himself forward, his face lighting up as he addressed the crowd, unafraid and confident. "Hi everyone," Malik began, his voice steady. "My name is Malik, and I wanted to tell you what it's like for me. A lot of times, people think that because I'm in a wheelchair, I can't do as much as other kids. But that's not true. I may do things differently, but I can still play, learn, and have fun. And I have big dreams just like everyone else. I want to be a scientist one day because I love figuring things out." The crowd erupted in applause, moved by his sincerity and the courage it took to share his dreams so openly. Mrs. Richards felt her chest swell with pride, marveling at how Malik had grown from the shy boy she had first met at the center into a young leader who could inspire others with his story. The rest of the day was filled with workshops, panel discussions, and breakout sessions. Teachers learned about adaptive teaching strategies, parents shared their experiences and challenges, and students participated in hands-on activities designed to foster understanding and empathy. One of the most popular workshops was a sensory walk, where participants navigated through a series of stations, simulating various physical and sensory limitations. Teachers and students took turns using wheelchairs, wearing weighted gloves, or using goggles that distorted their vision, gaining first-hand experience of what it might feel like to move through the world with different challenges. As she moved through the sessions, Mrs. Richards noticed Principal Hughes speaking with a group of teachers from neighboring schools, his face animated as he shared the success of Westbrook's Buddy program. Many of the teachers expressed interest in replicating the model, inspired by the difference it had made in student relationships. Mrs. Richards felt a surge of joy, knowing that her school's initiatives were beginning to ripple outward. By the end of the summit, the auditorium was alive with energy and excitement. Teachers spoke animatedly with each other, brainstorming new ways to support their students, while parents exchanged contact information, eager to continue the conversation beyond the day's events. As the attendees began to filter out, Mrs. Richards felt a gentle tap on her shoulder. She turned to find Sarah Thompson, Jordan's mother, standing beside her, a look of gratitude in her eyes. "Mrs. Richards, I just wanted to thank you," Sarah said, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "When we first met, I didn't know if you could truly understand Jordan's challenges. But seeing all of this today, the workshops, the speakers, the support, you've done more than I ever could have imagined. Jordan has been so much happier this year, and I know it's because of the changes you've made." Mrs. Richards felt a lump form in her throat as she reached out to squeeze Sarah's hand. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. I owe so much to Jordan and to students like him who have taught me what it truly means to be a teacher. I promise to keep doing everything I can to create a place where he and every child can feel like they belong." They exchanged a warm smile, and as Mrs. Richards watched Sarah leave, she felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The summit had been more successful than she could have dreamed, and she knew that it was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, the impact of the summit continued to grow. Schools across the district began implementing peer mentoring programs, sensitivity training, and adaptive learning initiatives. The community rallied around the cause, with local businesses and organizations offering resources and donations to support the new programs. Teachers shared their stories of transformation, describing how the summit had reshaped their approach to teaching, and parents reported that their children were coming home more empathetic and eager to help their peers. At Westbrook, Mrs. Richards implemented student voice meetings, where students were encouraged to share their thoughts and ideas on how to make their school more inclusive. She watched with pride as students who had once been shy or reluctant to speak up took the floor, their voices strong as they advocated for their peers. Jordan was particularly vocal, suggesting that the school introduce more accessible sports options and even helping to lead an adaptive PE class for younger students. One day, as she walked down the hallway, Mrs. Richards overheard a group of students talking in the cafeteria. "I think it's so cool that we have the buddy program," one girl said, her voice bright with enthusiasm. "I've learned so much from my buddy, and he's become one of my best friends." Another student chimed in, "Yeah, my buddy uses a wheelchair, and he's way better at math than me. We help each other all the time." Mrs. Richards felt a sense of pride swelling in her chest. These were the small but powerful changes that she had hoped for, and now she saw them coming to life before her eyes. The school wasn't just changing in policy, it was transforming in heart and spirit. As the school year came to an end, Mrs. Richards prepared to address the graduating class. She knew that her new position would keep her from teaching in a classroom directly, but she felt at peace, knowing that her work would continue to impact students in meaningful ways. Standing at the podium in the packed auditorium, she looked out over the crowd, her heart brimming with emotion. Her students, past and present, were gathered before her, along with parents, staff, and members of the community who had supported her vision from the start. "Today, we celebrate not only our graduates but the journey we've all taken together," she began, her voice steady but full of feeling. "I want to thank each of you, students, parents, teachers, and community members, for believing in the power of inclusion. Together, we've shown that a school is more than a building or a set of rules. It's a community, a place where every child is seen, valued, and encouraged to reach their full potential." She paused, glancing at Jordan and Malik, who sat in the front row, beaming up at her with pride. "I've had the honor of learning from students like Jordan and Malik, who have taught me that true strength lies not in our abilities, but in our willingness to lift each other up. They've reminded me that every child deserves a place where they can grow and dream without limitations. And as we continue on this journey, I know that our school, our community, and each of us will be better for it." The room erupted in applause, and Mrs. Richards felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. As she looked out over the sea of faces, she saw the promise of a brighter, more inclusive future, a future that she knew would be shaped by the seeds of empathy, compassion, and resilience that they had all planted together. As the crowd began to disperse, Jordan approached her, a small, handmade card in his hand. "Mrs. Richards," he said shyly, "I made this for you. It's a thank you card. For everything." She took the card, her heart swelling, as she read the words he had written in his neat handwriting. "Thank you, Mrs. Richards, for believing in me. You've made our school a better place. I'll always remember you." She hugged him tightly, tears in her eyes as she whispered, "Thank you, Jordan. I'll never forget you either." And as she stood there, surrounded by her students, colleagues, and community, Mrs. Richards knew that her journey had come full circle. She had set out to become a better teacher, and along the way, she had found something even more profound: a purpose, a legacy, and a new chapter in her life dedicated to making sure every child felt seen, valued, and capable of reaching their fullest potential. The lasting impact. As the years passed, the inclusive programs Mrs. Richards had pioneered grew beyond anything she could have imagined. What began as a small committee at Westbrook Elementary became a district-wide initiative, with neighboring schools eager to replicate the success of her work. Mrs. Richards had long since transitioned from her classroom into the role of Director of Student Inclusion and Support, devoting herself to advocating for systemic changes that supported students with diverse needs. Her office at the district headquarters became a hub of activity. Each wall was covered with charts, plans, and photographs of students engaged in various programs she had helped to create. Parents, teachers, and school administrators frequently stopped by, seeking her guidance on how to foster a more inclusive environment in their own schools. But her favorite visitors were the students, former students who had grown up under her mentorship, students from other schools who had benefited from her initiatives, and even students with disabilities who saw her as an ally and friend would often visit her, sharing stories of how her programs had helped them achieve their dreams. Every conversation reinforced her commitment, her resolve to ensure that no child was left behind or made to feel less than. One crisp autumn morning, Mrs. Richards received a letter that would mark a turning point in her career. It was an invitation from the State Department of Education, requesting her presence at an upcoming summit on educational reform. The letter explained that her work had gained attention at the state level and that they wanted her to lead a discussion on inclusive education policies. Reading the letter, she felt a surge of pride and disbelief. She had always seen herself as a humble teacher, working within her small community to make a difference. Yet now, her efforts were being recognized on a much larger scale. After years of dedicating herself to this cause, she was finally seeing the impact of her work ripple outward. The summit was held in the state capitol, a sprawling conference center filled with educators, administrators, and policymakers. Mrs. Richards felt a familiar wave of nerves as she took her place on the stage, facing a crowd of hundreds. But as she looked out over the sea of faces, she remembered the journey that had brought her here. The students like Jordan and Malik, who had taught her the true meaning of teaching, the colleagues who had supported her vision, and the countless parents who had trusted her with their children's futures. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice steady and clear. "Today, we're here to discuss a vision for education that goes beyond academics, a vision where every student feels valued, seen, and supported. My journey began with a simple but powerful realization. When we nurture compassion, resilience, and inclusivity, we create not only better schools, but a better society." The audience listened intently as she recounted the challenges, triumphs, and lessons she had learned along the way. She spoke about the transformations she had witnessed, not only in her students but in herself, and the remarkable power of creating a school culture rooted in empathy and support. Throughout the summit, she led workshops, answered questions, and shared the practical strategies that had worked for her district. She watched with joy as educators from all backgrounds and districts grew inspired, eager to bring these ideas back to their own schools. By the end of the summit, she had received dozens of emails from schools across the state requesting resources, guidance, and advice on implementing inclusive programs. But the most moving moment came when a young woman approached her, a shy but familiar smile on her face. Mrs. Richards realized it was Sarah, a former student she had taught in one of her first years at Westbrook. Sarah, who had struggled with dyslexia, had once been one of the students Mrs. Richards hadn't quite understood. She remembered the times she had pushed Sarah to work harder, not realizing that her challenges were different from those of her peers. "Mrs. Richards," Sarah began, her voice filled with emotion, "I just wanted to thank you. The work you're doing now. I wish it had been around when I was a student, but I'm so grateful that you're making this happen for the next generation." Mrs. Richards hugged her, feeling a bittersweet mix of pride and regret. She had come a long way since those early years, but she understood now that every moment of growth had prepared her to become the advocate she was today. As the years went by, her initiatives continued to expand. She worked with the district to secure funding for accessible classrooms, ensured that every school had dedicated counselors trained in inclusive education, and implemented a peer mentoring program that paired students with disabilities with trained student leaders who could offer academic and emotional support. Westbrook Elementary, where it had all begun, became a model school for inclusivity. Teachers there adapted lesson plans to accommodate all learning styles, and the buddy program Amy had suggested years ago flourished. It wasn't unusual to see older students helping younger ones with disabilities, guiding them through hallways or working together on projects. Jordan, now in high school, became a leader in the district's youth advocacy program. His confidence and self-assuredness were undeniable, his voice strong as he led discussions and organized events to raise awareness about inclusivity. He worked alongside Mrs. Richards as a student representative, helping to craft policies and provide feedback from the student perspective. One evening, At a district gala celebrating educators, Jordan took the stage to present Mrs. Richards with a Lifetime Impact Award. His face radiated pride and gratitude as he looked out over the audience, his voice filled with reverence. "I stand here today because someone believed in me when I didn't believe in myself," he began, his gaze fixed on Mrs. Richards. "Mrs. Richards taught me that my worth isn't defined by my limitations, but by my potential. She showed me that with the right support, I could achieve anything. This award might be for her, but I know that everyone here, especially her students, sees her as more than just a teacher. She's a mentor, a leader, and someone who has changed countless lives, including mine." The audience rose in a standing ovation, and as Mrs. Richards walked to the stage to accept the award, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She hugged Jordan tightly, her eyes brimming with tears, knowing that this moment was a culmination of everything she had worked for. As she spoke, she expressed her gratitude for the support she had received and shared her hope for a future where every child could experience the same sense of belonging and opportunity. She encouraged her fellow educators to continue the work, to challenge themselves, and to remember that every small act of kindness and empathy planted a seed that could one day blossom into profound change. When the applause finally quieted, Jordan joined her on stage, presenting her with a small handmade gift. She opened it to find a simple notebook filled with letters from her former students, each one sharing stories of how she had impacted their lives, how her belief in them had helped them achieve things they once thought impossible. As she flipped through the pages, she saw the names of students she hadn't heard from in years, students who had faced challenges she once hadn't understood, but had grown into resilient, confident adults. Their words painted a picture of the legacy she had created, a legacy of compassion, strength, and unwavering belief in the potential of every child. In the final letter, written by Jordan himself, she read, "Dear Mrs. Richards, thank you for being the teacher who saw us, who believed in us, and who changed the way we see ourselves. Because of you, we're not just students, we're dreamers, leaders, and change makers. We'll carry your lessons with us for the rest of our lives. You may have taught us, but you also taught the world around us that every person has a place and a purpose. We're proud to be part of your legacy." Mrs. Richards looked out over the audience, a feeling of peace and fulfillment washing over her. She knew that her work would continue, that the seeds she had planted would keep growing, nurtured by the students, parents, and educators who had joined her journey. As she left the stage that night, she walked away not as a teacher, but as a mentor who had dedicated her life to lifting others up, helping them see the beauty and strength within themselves. She had set out to change her school, but she had done so much more. She had sparked a movement, a legacy that would continue to shake the lives of countless students, showing them that no matter who they were or the challenges they faced, they had a place, a purpose, and a future filled with possibility.